All right, I'm going to make a couple of general observations first, and then we'll talk about individual speakers in the debate and some things that went well, some of the things that might have been a little bit problematic. First of all, I think everybody did a good job explaining what the issue was that you were talking about and trying to keep clear how the policy is going to work. They did such a good job that we heard about it 4 times in the constructive speeches. So those of us who might get confused, you know what, let me clarify again. And so it was pretty easy to follow there. I thought everybody did an excellent job of citing their evidence in the presentation. You were pretty consistent about giving us authorities, their expertise, and citing the quotes and statistics. So you did a good job on those kinds of things. One little bit of problem that I had was the signposting of the claims. There's a strong tendency to try and let the evidence make the arguments for you instead of your making the claims and then using the evidence to support that. And as a consequence, it often sounds like information is just being presented and I have no structure to follow. I'm in essence trying to figure out what the claims are based on the evidence that you used instead of, you know, here are the 3 reasons why we need cap and trade. The first one is it'll have these economic benefits, and then, you know, the EPA says blah, 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 or Montague says such and such and such, you know, that sort of thing. As it is, I get Montague says there are going to be all these consequences, so on and so forth, and I'm trying to take notes on what the evidence says. Okay, now what does that mean? And I'm having to try and figure out what the claim is there. So you need clearer declarative sentences. This is one of those things that we talked about like the first week in class when we were discussing, you know, one of the problems that oral arguments have is that people, they got a lot of information, but they're not always saying what the position is. And I'm not talking about your general position, because your general position is relatively clear. But on the individual points, it's a little hard to follow. All right, let's talk about the individual speakers. Sarah, I thought you started off pretty well identifying what the subject was, leading us in, giving us an explanation of what was going on here, an explanation about how cap and trade works. That's all fine. This is the place where we needed to have the stronger signpost beginning, where we have, I think people have this idea that because it's a speech, we don't want it to sound like an outline, but because it's a debate, we need an outline. And so there's nothing wrong with using some numerical signposts, and I think that's one of the things that's missing. You did have clearer claims in the first affirmative speech than we had in the other parts of the debate, but they're not really numbered, and sometimes I'm writing down a claim and I'm not sure if that's your next claim or the inference that I'm making, and how those claims are supposed to be structured. I could usually follow where there is an issue of significance or where there's an inherency issue, but it should be a little bit clearer for the audience to follow. And I thought you could explain the plan pretty well. There's a lot of information that you get. When you get to the solvency argument, you've got all of this comparative stuff. This is the thing that I find most interesting about the debate. You, in essence, in the first affirmative constructive, give this huge argument about how effective cap and trade is by looking at all these past experiences we've had, including the EPA's use of the Clean Air Act to do cap and trade to reduce SO2 and other kinds of pollutants and so on and so forth. And we got a lot of examples on those kinds of things. There's even an argument about Europe and some of the impact it's had. You know, there's a 3% decline in pollution. I'm not sure if it was the carbons, but I think that's information that needs to get utilized later on in the debate, because later the negative is making an argument that says that it didn't have any effect in Europe, and we don't get any direct response to that particular point, and you've got an argument there. The reason I thought that point was so interesting is because the negative basically comes up and says exactly the same thing. The EPA kicks ass on regulating pollution. They've done all this kind of effective stuff. We should trust them to implement regulations that will have a positive effect, and in fact they've already done so. All right, so now I'm wondering, how's this going to work out? And it comes back that the negative is going to say, well, the EPA is good, but they're not that good. Or they got some kind of a problem. And the negative is going to come back and say, you know, the EPA, they're excellent. And basically, you're given the same evidence that they gave in the first affirmative constructive about how effective the EPA is. So you want to point out that there's, the negative should be pointing out that there's a contradiction, an inherent contradiction in the affirmative's position. They've said that the EPA's programs demonstrate that cap and trade could work, but we can't trust the EPA. They're going to go piecemeal. It's too complex for them to handle. Instead, it's much better if we create this new marketplace where traders and investors and all those kinds of people can come in and figure out what's best instead of having the EPA do it. And I think that that would set up a lot of resistance to the affirmative's arguments during the rest of the speech, especially when you guys both come back and talk about how there's a chance for fraud with offsets and these other kinds of things, and how some of the people who are strongly backing this are the same people that got us into this financial crisis later on. You say, okay, now, who should we trust? The EPA, who's implementing regulations, has had an effect on carbon levels and has had past experience, or this new market system that is apparently going to be controlled by these same people that got us into the financial crisis. That's a strong, powerful argument to make against the position that the affirmative's got, and you need to make it a little bit more clearly. So, because you've got the issue right there, and it's been set up by the two sides on the inherency argument. I also found it interesting, let's move a little bit to the negative side for a second. The negative basically grants all the significance justification that the affirmative has. There is no challenge to what environmental impact there might be on global climate change, that we need to regulate this, that it's going to have these long-term consequences. I thought their significance claims were a little vague to start with. All they had was some numerical data about what the long-term economic impact was going to be, and they mentioned billions of dollars, and then you guys had some other calculations about what the ratio of harm would be to cost. It's like we're going to save 30 times as much in environmental damage as we would in what we spend to protect it. And I'm going, okay, well, what's all this terrible, horrible, awful stuff that's going to happen? We don't get much description of that, but that's okay because you guys say, we're not going to challenge that at all. And I think there are a lot of arguments out there that suggest that the estimates are overstated, that the EPA, I could see maybe why you wouldn't want to contradict yourself, because the EPA is so good on this other kind of thing, but there's a lot of stuff that says the EPA has bought a pig and a poke here on a whole bunch of this information, and they're making inferences based on data that is speculative at best, scientific models that are not potentially reliable, that there is considerable contradictory evidence that suggests alternative issues are responsible for these kinds of things. And in essence, the only way, the U.S., admittedly, the affirmative says the U.S. is only responsible for like 1/5 of all of this. That means that 80% of the problem's coming from somewhere else. And the only evidence that we have that the U.S.'s action is going to make a difference is Al Gore says, we're leaders and people, we're going to follow, they're going to follow us. And I'm going, okay, really? That's going to be the impact that we have? I think you need to have something stronger than that. And since you guys have attacks on the European cap and trade system at one point, I think that's a good place to start, to say, well, the Europeans are doing it, and I mean, I've heard criticism of the European cap and trade system that in essence says basically what they've done is they've shifted all the, well, you said it, the CO2 emissions have gotten worse, and they've basically just bought up credits from all the poor countries. It's a transfer of wealth to poor countries without any concomitant reduction in emissions. Why is our plan going to result in anything different, and why is our action going to inspire people to act differently or change what they're doing, especially if it's been rewarding and giving them $30 billion, which is what the negative says at one point that this new market creates. So you've got, I just think it's kind of interesting that the significance issue is never about what the long-term impact is going to be. It's all just about which one of these systems is the one that's going to be more reliable. This is almost like a counter plan, because there's not really any dispute on the significance issue, and it's just whether or not the present system is going to work effectively or this other system will work more effectively. And it seems strange that there wasn't any conflict on that. Shannon, I thought you did an okay job trying to follow the issues that were being presented. Again, we got the introduction on the issue and an explanation about how it's supposed to work. You do have some evidence that talks about this exchange, how it's supposed to create this big market, and then there's an argument about the harms, and that's where you talk about the free permits and the offsets, and that first gets introduced. And those turn into disadvantage arguments and workability arguments that your partner is going to develop a little bit more, which is fine, since, like I said, you guys aren't talking about the significance claim for the most part. There is a good solvency, but there are several places where there are good solvency arguments that you're making. In the first negative, you've got this evidence that says, look, California's been trying to do this, and here's all it hasn't made any difference in the emissions, and it's screwed up the economy here. I never heard the affirmative say anything about California's model. You know, and that would have been one of those things that you want to come back and say, look, we know in the U.S. the largest economy in the country, the largest state economy in the country, hasn't been able to have this particular effect that they're talking about. So the idea that the U.S. is going to have a big effect, I think, is a little bit problematic. And then I think there is some data from the affirmative on the European thing that says it does work. They've got a statistic somewhere that says there's a 3% reduction, I think, in pollutants. That might actually have been in the first affirmative constructive, yeah. There was a 3% reduction. But you've got this other argument that says that there wasn't any substantial change, and in fact it got worse. Well, that's a place where we ought to have a little bit more clash and explanation. Are your numbers different than theirs? Is there an explanation? Did they include something that you didn't include? Did you include something that they didn't include? How are we supposed to assess these things? How did the Europeans assess this? We got contradictory claims, and there's not a lot of analysis going on that particular claim. So I think that's a place that could be developed. And then like I said, the argument, you know, and even if we don't know what happened with the European model, we do know what happened with the California model, and there hasn't been any discussion of that from the affirmative side. So that comes back, and I think you've got a good solvency argument that you're kind of working on there, plus a potential disadvantage. The disadvantages don't grow much more than the original issues about the market having problems. That maybe there are a few issues, so they get developed a little bit more, and I'll talk about that in a second, Rochelle, excuse me. Christian, I thought that you know, again, you start off, you follow the case structure pretty well, although we don't have the signposts to link the arguments to. You know, I'm trying to take notes here, as you can see, you know, follow things along. You know, I don't always get the signpost that this is an extension of this particular argument, but as I'm listening, I can kind of hear how those arguments are connected to something else that's being talked about. I did not always get particular applications to issues that the negative had brought up, and I think, you know, everybody's on the EPA thing. This is where This is what your your inherency argument comes down to. Since they're not denying the significance claim anymore, then it's just a question of whether the cap or trade system that you're proposing is going to work more effectively than the EPA's system is going to work. And you've got a good argument here that says the EPA is kind of ill-suited to do this. It's going to be piecemeal. There's going to be litigation, so on and so forth. And I think that's an interesting argument. By the way, I think it would be there's a potential good argument for the negative there that they never follow up on, but you've got a good inherency argument here. That's why we don't want to have the EPA. We want to have this other system because it's innovative, because it's based on incentives instead of trying to force something through, because people will be motivated to cooperate with it instead of feeling like they're being taxed in order to cooperate in it. And that's the way you want to phrase this argument during the rest of the debate. And you get to that a couple of times. I'm not sure that it was as clear as you wanted it to be. The thing I was thinking about is, okay, wait a second. The affirmative has just said this is a complicated process that's too difficult for the EPA to do, that there's going to be litigation issues, and it potentially could cost jobs if we make bad decisions. What reason do we have to believe that a marketplace that doesn't currently exist is going to be able to resolve all of those problems? And that's where you need to put the onus back on them and say, you're the ones who are saying this. You've made the criticism of the one organization that we know has worked, And now you're saying, and we need something new and different. Well, let's see that it works. And that's where the European thing should come in again. If you've got good evidence that says the European model is working, that we've got those outcomes, that would be good. Now, Rochelle later on has some of those arguments about the offsets and about the free permits that she talks about. And so there's some corruption stuff and things that are going on there. And I think that's a good criticism of the general model. And then you've got the one example where they did something, was it in India? Indonesia, where they cut down all the trees to put in a palm oil plantation that's supposed to reduce it, and it doesn't really do anything, and instead created a worse impact. Well, is that what's going on in Europe? Was that something that's a result of the European model? Here's one of those overseas countries that bought up or sold off their rights to some European country, and and this is the result. This is what we're getting. I think those things need to be put together a little bit more.